and welcome to this video presentation where we will be looking at the question, should God be conceived in terms of gender? Now, many common conceptions of God strike up the image of God existing as a physical being, usually with an ascribed gender that's typically male. This is especially true in Christianity, where the notion of God is given a masculine identity and is referred to as a father or Lord. And if you were to ask anyone on the street, in this case we'd be talking about most Western countries, if you were to ask them what they think God looks like, they would typically give an answer that illustrates God as an elderly bearded male. But if we were to look at the history of Christianity, as well as some other religions, we will see that this consensus has a bit more of a complicated relationship with linguistics, as well as its associated cultural constructs. Now, as we've seen in Christianity, the notion of God is given a masculine identity. This in fact contradicts Judaic, Islamic, and African religions, who characterize God as genderless. And even though Judaism forbids imagery of God, he is often described with masculine synonyms as a father, a protector, and even though it's forbidden to characterize God as a man in Judaism, he is still described with characteristics that we would normally associate with a masculine identity. Now, in Islam, there's quite an interesting pronoun use used to describe God, as even though he's given a masculine pronoun and is referred to as a he, it's used with a masculine unreal pronoun, so that the masculinization of God is done in the same way that you would masculinize a table or a chair or any inanimate object. So it's quite hard for Westerners to get their head around if they're not familiar with the Islamic language. But the characterization of God in Islam as a male is purely linguistic and is in fact genderless. So the pronoun used to describe God in Christianity is one that also contributes to our characterization of good and evil, also the structure of society and its aesthetics. And as with religious conceptions of a deity, our notion of God also represents an ideal of what qualities one must have to be virtuous. So the gendering of God also gives us an aesthetic representation of that gender as an ideal. And considering the effect that gendering a deity has on the grander scheme of things, is it right to conceive God in terms of gender? With the masculine as an ideal that informs our notions of how our society should function, and what we attribute to masculinity should also be the qualities that we should look for in how we deal with the challenges from day-to-day life, and that we should look for in our superiors, leaders, and political figures. We should then look at the linguistic factors involved with characterizing an object, such as God, and then ascribing that object with a gender. So in order for us to understand the pronoun use of God and its associations, we need to take a look at linguistics a little bit closer, particularly with Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who saw the identity given to objects through the signifier, the signified, and the sign. So the signifier is the word or the image, in this case being God. The signified, which is the concept that is associated with the signifier, and the sign, being the outcome or meaning gained. So, in the case of the Christian notion of God, the word God acts as a signifier. The concept of God as a deity, an all-powerful creator, is being signified, and the sign of God becomes an all-powerful creator. So in order for us to understand the pronoun use of God and its associations, we need to take a look at linguistics a little bit closer, particularly with Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who saw the identity given to objects through the signifier, the signified, and the sign. So the signifier is the word or the image, in this case being God. The signified, which is the concept that is associated with the signifier, and the sign, being the outcome or meaning gained. So, in the case of the Christian notion of God, the word God acts as a signifier. The concept of God as a deity, an all-powerful creator, is being signified, and the sign of God becomes an all-powerful creator. Now, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan takes this idea a little bit further. Whilst we have individual signs, Lacan shows us that these signs are infinite and associated with one another, forming a chain of signs. In his book Cretes, he says that the property of the signifier, that of combining according to the laws of a closed order, affirms the necessity of a topological substratum, of which the term I ordinarily use signifying chain, which gives an approximate idea, links by which a necklace firmly hooks onto a link of another necklace named links. So if we apply this concept of a chain of signs with the idea of a Christian God, we can see the ideological implications with applying a gender to God. With the gendering of God as male, the signifier of masculinity becomes interchangeable with other signifiers to represent masculinity as well, such as power, courage, independence, assertiveness, and duty. So if we have God as a signifier, then we can use the signifier masculinity to signify God, and then we can have the terms of power to signify masculinity. So all of these signs then become linked together. And in Lacan's reading of Hegel, the image of God becomes the signified object of desire, and its chain of signs become other objects that the subject also desires as a means to become one with God. So in this quote here, Lacan says, "For in Hegel's work, it is desire that is given responsibility for the minimal link the subject must retain to antiquity's knowledge if truth is to be immanent in the realization of knowledge. The cunning of reason means that from the outset and right to the end, the subject knows what he wants." So, to describe this a little less complicatedly, the image of God becomes a sublime object, which the subject, that being the individual who worships God, then has to attribute the notions of masculinity with notions of virtue. In order to be closer to God, one must be virtuous and more masculine. And the negations of God, or a masculine identity, thus being signifiers of femininity, become signifiers of heresy. And we can see this dialectic operating in our political system today, with notions of masculinity being attributed to a strong and powerful leader, with its opposition being characterized as weak, submissive, but also seductive and dangerous. So we can see that the gendering of God has problematic ramifications that affect the nature of our cultural and political institutions. But what can be done about it? Well, Gilles Deleuze, who is a student of Lacan, introduces the concept of deterritorialization, where the images of the self, portrayed by the constructs of its surrounding culture, are deconstructed, and in the absence of an object of desire, a new identity can then re-territorialize itself. And without a dogmatic representation of what the virtues of order should be, the individual can then construct their own identity. So Lacan builds on the idea of the chain of signs that are converted into commodity signifiers as a means to generate collective desire. So this happens in capitalist ideology, where the aesthetic representations of God then become transformed into commodities, where our desire then becomes trapped and used to produce capital. But in Deleuze's case, a materialist revolution can't decode these chains, and will only cause them to reappear in a different form. As its roots extend beyond capitalist ideology, in fact, even further than religion itself, and goes all the way back to our linguistic representations of how we characterize objects. Deleuze then provides us with a possible solution to this problem, and that's through schizoanalysis, a form of thought that isn't coded through capitalist ideology. As our desires have become trapped within capitalist ideology, where the things that we desire are objects that have to be bought in order to sustain the economy, or through religious ideology, where our notions of virtue are tied to masculinity, these signifiers can actually be deterritorialized, and the subject can then construct their own identity in the absence of a chain of signs linked to God and its gender.